Welcome everyone to CG seminar number 198, and our topic is again Latin American. This time we're looking more broadly than Chile that we looked at last Thursday, and considering decolonisation, a theme which I think many people around the world are focused on at the moment, and let's hope they keep being focused on it, because it's tremendously exciting and important, and it goes to the larger geopolitical spatial transformations that are happening worldwide, with the rise of China and East Asia, India, as well as Latin America, Sub-Saharan Africa. Things are changing, and the decolonisation movement captures, I think, some of that and accelerates the process of change. And there's nowhere in the world where the intellectual debate is as exciting, I think, as what's coming out of Latin America in relation to decolonisation. So we are now in that debate today, and our three speakers, whom I'll introduce in a moment, will take us well into it. But let me just go through the webinar protocols before we start. Remember that the webinar is being recorded and will be posted online on the CG website, usually within 48 hours. And you can watch the webinar forever, watch Gunther and Carolina and Alma again and again and again on YouTube. The transcript of the chat function today will also be posted on the CG website. Now, please keep yourself muted during the webinar unless you have been asked to speak or you get to the point where you're asking your question. There's no need to have your video on during the webinar, but please turn it on when you're asking a question. We recommend using speaker view so you can more clearly see who is talking. To ask a question, use the chat function. We compose the Q&A which is an important part of our webinars, on the basis of what's coming into the chat. So it's a really good idea to put your questions or statements in early. You're more likely to get into the discussion that way. And we find that some very good ideas come forward late in the webinar and we can't accommodate them, unfortunately. So start writing towards the end of the speaking time, which will be around about 25 past the hour, and you will get into the Q&A part of the discussion. Now, when you're invited to ask your question in the Q&A, you unmute yourself, most important. You switch on your video and then you state your name and where you are from and then speak. Okay, it's a pleasure now to introduce my colleagues for this who will lead us in this webinar. Alma Maldonado earned her PhD at Boston College's Center for International Higher Education in the Hans de Witt Phil-Albach part of the world, and was an assistant professor at the Center for the Study of Higher Education at the University of Arizona, which is when I first began to work with Alma. She's now been, since 2010, a researcher at the Departamento de Investigaciones, Educativas. You're not going to like my Spanish colleagues, in Mexico City. Her work focuses on comparative politics in higher education, particularly Latin America, globalization, academic mobility, international organizations. She's published in English and Spanish in those topic areas. Carolina Guzmán Valenzuela, a valued colleague who has been with us before in this webinar and seminar program, and is now working at the Faculty of Education at the Universidad de Tarapaca in Chile. She was at the University of Chile. She's now moved, as we do in our academic careers. And her research focuses on neoliberalism and the impact on universities, public-private distinction in higher education, north-south divide. She works on global knowledge and its inclusions and exclusions. She's a well-published scholar, very active, whose work is becoming increasingly, I think, known and influential. And Gunther Dietz, whom I haven't met before. Really nice to meet you, Gunther. Grew up in southern Chile and in northern Germany. Studied anthropology, philosophy, and philology in Göttingen and Hamburg. And his doctorate is from Hamburg. He's taught at universities in Germany, Spain, Belgium, Denmark, Mexico, and Spain again. And currently he's a research professor in intercultural studies at Veracruzana, Universidad Veracruzana in Axalapa, in Mexico, where he works on multiculturalism, ethnicity, interculturality, and intercultural and interreligious aspects of education. And he's working on indigenous pathways through higher education in Mexico at the moment and on funded projects. So that's tremendous range, I think, from the three of you. And we look forward to what you'll say about decolonization. And I think we start with Alma. The screen is yours.
Thank you very much. Good morning in this part of the world. Good afternoon in that part of the world and everywhere. So first of all, I'm really glad to be here. I would like to thank Carolina for putting this webinar together. She invited me to discuss this morning with you this, as Simon said, very important issue. It's very nice to see Simon as well. I haven't seen him in a while. So I am really glad that I am the first person in talking today, because I think I want to present some very general ideas about this debate, which is very important not only in Latin America, but also in other regions of the world. I think it is fascinating. It's a very fascinating time to discuss this issue in Mexico, given the political and the ideological debates we are dealing today. Just 2 days ago, the mayor of Mexico City declared that Mexico did not live a conquest, but an invasion. And let's say an Spanish invasion, right? So even the most conservative people even the most conservative people I have known in the country cannot at least express their surprise by such idea. If we were not contest, it is really hard to talk about colonization. If we cannot discuss about colonization, it is hard to discuss decolonization. So the issue about and the debate about what concepts and what words we are using and how are we taking the debate, the historical debate is important today, of course. Obviously, colonization in Latin America is a big issue. In my opinion, it's also, we tend to deny the debate about colonization because it happened so many years, so many centuries ago. But still, of course, is very important in the sense of how this process affected, construct us, and help us to understand also this identity that we built in the whole region. Colonization in Latin America, perhaps except in Brazil, meant three things in my opinion. One was language, the second was religion, and the third was education. And I said except Brazil because, as you know, in Brazil, the establishment of universities took a while to start it, but not in the Spanish colonies, where the first thing that the Spaniards did when they arrived was to build churches and to build schools, obviously to teach the language and to teach the education. So this is why Harvard, of course, the University of Harvard is not the oldest established in the Americas, but the San Marcos University, obviously the Santo Domingo University, and the Pontific Royal University of New Spain in Mexico around the 1550. There are some debates about the dates. So as I mentioned, these debates are relevant even today in the politics, in the political arena in the country, where we are saying, well, what was this legacy, contribution, and how are dealing with that. So when we discuss the colonization of universities in Latin America, it is really important also to think about how are we defining science today and how are we defining universities today. What is a science? What is a university professors? Because the idea of universities was born in Europe. I think that is also another statement that is hard to deny. The model that we know as universities was born there. Obviously, the idea of higher education was or existed in previous cultures, and we know that, and we acknowledge that, but not the idea of universities. Universities today are still doing the same things they were doing when they were established. They are constructing or creating knowledge, they are teaching, and they are accrediting that knowledge. And I think we still have that model, and it's just hard to not see that and not to understand that. So we have a legitimate model of university that was based and was born in Europe, and that is for sure something that is happening, and also an idea of science and the idea of how science is defined and constructed. So what I see is three problematic points, and I want to use the rest of my time discussing these three points. The first is how ideology and political positions are defining these debates and how power is related to that, right? Because I think this is a very, as I said, a current debate. The second is that obviously, we all accept that there are a lot of criticisms in the way we have created science and in the way universities work. And I just want to use 2 or 3 examples of how these criticisms are important and are relevant, and I think they are changing universities. One has to do with meritocracy. I think today we are in this huge debate about what is meritocracy and what is the meaning and how are we challenging this whole idea that, you know, was very important in the way meritocracy is the base on how we do science and how we do academia. And I think this is a big challenge. The second, obviously, is gender. I think today, you know, from the past, what we were discussing, how we were doing things, today, the gender debate is very important and relevant, and is changing institutions and higher education. And the third one is access. I think it's related, obviously, but it's not only about gender, and it's about minorities, and it's about how fair the access is, and how much justice can we discuss regarding access. And the third one is alternatives and options, because I think when we discuss decolonization in universities, it is very easy to say, well, we need other options, we need alternatives. But when I study and read what are these options and alternatives, I am worried about what we are also looking at, because I think that generally speaking, we are tending to this epistemic relativism, which can be also very tricky and not very solid intellectually and not very solid academically. And I am going to use some examples here. Well, first of all, to say that the debate about how we define science, cultures, obviously it's a very long debate. I was reading lately the debates that C.P. Snow in 1959 was putting there when he was discussing that humanities and sciences are 2 different cultures. And in many ways, what we're discussing here, it has to do with this definition of cultures. What are the cultures involved? And how can we recover the indigenous cultures, the importance of that, the importance of understanding the indigenous worldview, and which I think is very relevant in our countries. But at the same time, what what can we do when these indigenous worldviews are opposite to what science has stated, or to what science or to what we understand as development? And obviously this is a big clash, but what I want to say is this is not new, and this also had to do with disciplines, and it had to do with traditions. So it shouldn't be something that takes us by surprise. My time is almost over, but I just would like to say that I was reading this piece. In Mexico, we are dealing with this many important policy debates about how are we changing universities and political, the scientific policies and so on. And when I read what are these positions that the government is pushing related to the horizontal construction of knowledge, I'm really worried about how far we can go to the other side, and how easy can be to just go or move to this relativism that could be not good at the end for the whole development of the country. And I will stop here. Thank you.
Carolina.
Okay. Good morning and good afternoon, everyone. And thank you very much, Alma, for this presentation. And thank you, Simon, for giving us this space to talk about decolonizing and the university. Let me see, I want to share my full screen. There you are. So basically what I am going to do in my presentation is sharing some reflections about colonialism, coloniality, and decoloniality of power. And while I am sharing these thoughts with you, I'm going to share some images. Basically, my presentation is going to be about historical notes about colonialism. I agree with Alma when she says that in order to understand our present, we need to have in consideration our past, and in that way we can glimpse a future as well. So my argument is that Latin American universities are shaped by forms of colonialism that come from the past, extend to the present and the future. As Alma mentioned, Latin America has a long history of colonialism. It started with the discovery and the conquest of the Americas from the 15th century onwards by both Spain and Portugal. It first involved the conquest of lands and the exploitation of assets, resources, and peoples. Later on, these processes were accompanied by the imposition of a culture, language, religion, and a legal system by the settler countries. Some authors refer to the concept of imperialism as an imposition of an ideology or ways of thinking and acting that are considered superior upon territories whose inhabitants' visions, values, and practices are considered inferior. In this picture, you can see the power of the church. The church had a very important role jointly with the Spanish and the Portuguese crown in colonizing the Americas. According to the Peruvian sociologist Aníbal Quijano, modernity is a concept that was born in Europe. However, it cannot be fully understood without processes of colonialism in the Americas. Modernity is usually located in Europe and attached to the Renaissance and the Age of Reason, and later to the Enlightenment period. According to Quijano, modernity and colonialism are two intertwined concepts. And this is why Quijano coined the concept of coloniality, which is the fusion of two words, colonialism and modernity. In these pictures, basically, you can see issues and facts taking place in Europe. The first one is about early modern Europe, Venice. Then the second one is about Gutenberg, who introduced printing in Europe. And the third one is related to the Enlightenment period, where all the sciences, arts, humanities, philosophy, and politics were having an incredible moment. Now they were having a lot of developments. So when thinking about modernity, according to Quijano, we need to think about colonialism in the Americas. Why? Coloniality designates a structural matrix of power based on two axes. The first one is race, and the second one is labor. Race is a category that establishes a difference between the white superior conquerors and the non-white conquered indigenous people perceived as inferiors. Labor involves the control and division of labor around the production, appropriation of, and distribution of resources and products into the global market, so that the white peoples were entitled to exploit the indigenous lands, appropriate their resources, and trade them to increase their wealthiness. Through labor and race divisions, the Spanish and Portuguese settlers and their descendants retain and reinforce a major part of the financial and social capital over the centuries, while the indigenous peoples suffered from exploitation, impoverishment, and discrimination. According to Quijano, this domination was exported to the rest of the world, so giving way to the modern era in which conquered European, white, wealthy countries established their supremacy over countries with indigenous and local populations in Australia, Africa, and Asia. In these images, you can see this race and labor divisions. On the left-hand side, you can see a family composed of probably a Spanish guy with his wife or partner, and she's indigenous, and the baby is a mestizo, which is a mixture of Spaniards and indigenous peoples. And on the right-hand side, you can see a pyramid. On the bottom, you can see slaves, then indigenous peoples, and then mestizos, mulattoes, and zambos, these mixtures of races. Then the criollos, who were born in the Americas and who were descendants of the Spaniards, and then the Spanish, the church, and the army. My argument is that colonial ways of thinking and realizing the university in Latin America were present not only in colonial times, but are present now. Over the centuries, Latin American universities have reinforced this matrix of powers based on labor and race divisions, and they are adding more discriminations and systems based on power. There are therefore new ways of colonialism, and these new ways of colonialism had to do with a Western model of university that draws on the conception of prestige and the marketization of higher education that have been dictating contemporary imaginaries about what it means to be a university, based on competition for prestige, mainly gained through research. And these narratives about a Western model of university have been shaping universities not only in Latin America, but around the world. This Western model of university has prompted processes of stratification within countries and across regions. As a result, the most prestigious universities are mainly in wealthy countries such as the USA and the UK. Even though universities in Asian countries, especially China, have been improving their performance in international rankings in the last decade, numbers show that they are less cited than American researchers, for example. So such a model of the prestigious westernized university has penetrated deep inside universities in the periphery. As those on notes, knowledge production within the academy relies largely on methodological tools, theoretical premises, and styles of writing and argumentation developed and entrenched by European and American scholars. While wealthy universities and corporations in the global north have been exporting this model of university and reinforcing their power and prestige, Latin American universities have been keen on importing such a model. It seems, however, that Latin American universities have had little success in imitating westernized models of universities. Latin American universities do not have the academic capital to do it. In this context, Latin American universities and their academics have a key role not only in contesting these old and new forms of colonialism, but also in producing new ways of thinking about the university and in promoting critical agencies to transform both universities and Latin America. I'm going to stop here because I'm sure that my colleague Gunther is going to talk about intercultural universities and their role they have had in trying to contest these narratives about elite and westernized models of universities. But I just want to say that intercultural universities have been a very nice expression, spaces that promote interculturality and critical agencies and basically the idea is not denying Western knowledges, but at least the idea is recognizing that there are non-Western knowledges that have a place and a value in our universities in Latin America. Thank you very much.
Gunther.
Hello to everybody. Thank you very much for the invitation. Thank you, Simon, Trevor, but also Carolina for preparing this panel. We heard two very interesting presentations, and I would just like to make some footnotes on these presentations with some examples maybe from the processes going on in Mexico, but they are somehow also representative of other trends in Latin America. First of all, I think we should remember what we are talking about institutionally. Universities are the most conservative institutions in the world, maybe together with the Vatican, the Catholic Church. And because of this conservatism, they tend to take longer in order to change, in order to decolonize. The Catholic Church is trying to decolonize itself, to indigenize its institutions in Latin America. And I guess now in the 21st century, also universities are entering this, in my opinion, necessary process, because it's a process of Latin Americanizing higher education. Decolonizing is not about relativism, in my opinion, but about positionality. From where are we talking about? From which territory of knowledge are we talking about? And this contextualization has not taken place. If you come to a Latin American university, you will immediately feel at home because it's a mimesis of European universities. But as Carolina said, it's the copy. It's not the original. And so now there are certain trends happening which can turn Latin American universities, in my opinion, into original proposals for change. In Latin America, we have the problem that, as Carolina also mentioned, this is very similar to what she just showed. We have a coincidence of two processes, historical processes. On the one hand, we have a persistent coloniality, which this Cuadro de Castas from the 18th century shows. It's this overlapping of race, class, gender inequalities. And this colonial basis of society has not been changed by administrative political independence. And secondly, we have a strong process of nationalization since the 19th century, which meant assimilation, which meant importing European models even more than in colonial times. For example, in the sphere of language diversity, the colonial powers have not been as successful as the national powers in killing, in making disappear indigenous languages. And so we should consider both processes, the process of coloniality and the process of nationalization. And contemporarily, nowadays, there is a struggle going on inside all Latin American societies of state structures of colonial and post-colonial origin, trying to come to terms with societal structures. And society in many of our countries means that there are groups which have been systematically excluded from institutional participation. And school and higher education is one of these arenas for struggles. So the new relationship indigenous peoples and Afro-descended communities are trying to establish with their nation states, this new relationships will mean necessarily a deep transformation also of higher education because of what Alma and Carolina explained before. So we have the continent with the highest internal inequality rates worldwide. We have huge problems of access to higher education. And in this context, we have attempts at overcoming policies which combine exclusion from education with certain kind of inclusion, but an assimilating kind of education. Throughout the whole of Latin America, we have, since the 19th century, this nationalist rhetorics, which starts in primary school and ends in higher education, which excludes languages, excludes knowledges, epistemologies, ways of seeing the world. And nowadays, when these groups enter university, young people from indigenous or Afro-descendant background enter the university, they will, of course, also start to claim a curricular presence. So we have made lots of analysis in the whole of Latin America. Daniel Mato from Argentina has presented many publications on different trends of different types of reactions by universities, by already established universities. And so this goes from very weak reactions, which are affirmative action programs, quota programs in certain universities, and goes, I have not the time to go through into detail of each of the typologies, but goes until the creation of so-called indigenous community or intercultural educations. I want to talk a little bit about these. Mexico is the only country where we have a whole system of nowadays 10 intercultural university, publicly financed intercultural universities. But in Peru, in Bolivia, in Ecuador, in Colombia, there are also other kinds of intercultural universities. Sometimes they are started from the bottom up, sometimes they are started more from top down. There are governmental initiatives, but also non-governmental initiatives. There are some church-run universities as well. And what they have in common is an attempt at adapting training of young people, university training in certain areas, adapting it to the local circumstances, not by imposing a Western way of dealing with knowledge, but by establishing dialogues between Western ways of teaching and learning and indigenous or Afro-descended ways of teaching and learning. And so at the outcome of this process, which is a conflictive process, inside these universities, both the governmental one and the non-governmental one, the community-run one, face similar problems and similar challenges. One major challenge means somehow to reinvent curriculum. Once you include students from community backgrounds who have a completely different cultural capital, a completely different worldview about what university means, what the future for them means, what community compromises they have to accomplish, etc. You have to change this fixed curriculum, which in our university still, apart from innovative initiatives, it's still a very much supply-driven curriculum. It's a disciplinary background which nourishes a certain certain study program. And now we are shifting in the intercultural universities from this supply side orientation to a demand side orientation. The curriculum is established after the young people enter the universities with a certain kind of project, a learning project, which also means a community transformation project. And depending on this project, the demands established by the communities will mean different kinds of curricular itineraries throughout the study program. And so this we call an inductive turn in curriculum, because it means we don't need fixed study programs. We need flexible paths to learning, where a certain percentage of learning takes place inside campus, and another part of learning takes place outside of campus. And so very innovative study programs, both BAs and postgraduate programs, are emerging inside these universities, comprising language, culture issues, pedagogical issues, but also engineering science, natural science, sustainable development studies, etc. So it's a different approach to the structure of a university curriculum. This is the first thing I wanted to pinpoint. The second one is a really decolonial approach to language diversity. It is not healthy, in my opinion, that universities in such linguistically diverse countries as ours in Latin America still rely on one or maybe two European origin imperial languages in order to transfer knowledge. We know from lots of debates in epistemology and in philosophy that you cannot express the same view of the world in every language, but certain influences of the language itself is exerted when you transmit a knowledge. And I think in the crisis we are facing currently as civilizations, it's not healthy, it is not understandable to go on excluding hundreds of languages which can be transmitters of different kinds of knowledges which until now have never reached university. So in this sense, it's important to work with linguistic diversity and to accompany a decolonization process through which Nahuatl, Popoluca, Purépecha, Mapuzungun, etc., again recover their capacity to name the world in the sense of Freire, to name the world in their own terms. This is the decolonial potential of these universities. It is not a one-to-one translation if you name the word in Nahuatl or in Spanish or in Oxbridge English. It is a different form of translation, and it means appropriating the world and transforming it in your own mind. And this cannot happen if you do it by imposing a language which is not my mother tongue, or a language which is a colonial or an imperial language, and it's not the language of the community or of the region. In this sense, intercultural universities are much quicker decolonizing these processes than the high-ranked general universities, the conventional universities, which still insist maybe teaching about indigenous cultures, maybe teaching a Nahuatl course, but they do not transmit knowledge in these languages. So it's not about language courses. It's about teaching and learning different subject areas in your own language and in other languages. And so in that sense, we just in February this year started the first in the whole of Latin America master program only taught in an indigenous language. It's the Master in Language and Nahuatl Language and Culture, which is offered at the Universidad Veracruzana Intercultural in Tequila, a tiny Nahuatl community in the Sierra de Songolica. And every material is in Nahuatl, and all the teaching and learning, the writing is done from the beginning until the thesis in the Nahuatl language. This is a precondition if you really want to decolonize languages in order to make them and give them the opportunity to dialogue with academic language. So you need academic variants of indigenous languages. The same has happened to my own mother tongue, to German, which has never been used until the 16th, 17th, 18th century inside a university. but it developed academic variants, and through these, it could enter university knowledge. And so in this sense, it is not about relativism, it's about pluralizing ways of knowing. And I think this is what our societies currently need. Finally, another contribution of these kinds of universities is that the main pillars of university activities, which are, as Alma already mentioned, teaching, research, but also outreach, as it is normally known. These pillars in our conventional universities are isolated normally from each other. There's a lot of debate about this. I won't go into detail, but intercultural or community universities, what they try to do in a much more successful way, in my opinion, is to closely link teaching and learning, research, learning as research, and outreach in the sense of community service, but a community service which includes teaching and learning and which includes research activities. And so in that sense, I'm skipping some details, in that sense, it means that universities try to start to change their structure. It's not about admitting different kinds of students. It's about the whole logic of the university. And this means new relationships between university and community. And I think in that sense, community, indigenous, and intercultural universities can show certain future paths also for conventional universities, because conventional universities have always defended, and they needed, I understand, they needed to defend their autonomy from the existing powers. But these universities also are autonomous, are independent, are isolated from their circumstances, from their neighborhoods, from their communities. And I think in the future, only those universities will survive, which really have a positive impact on their surroundings, on their immediate neighborhoods. And in this sense, I think we need new indicators for talking about innovation in universities, including these community relationships, the quality of these relationships with regard to other universities, which are highly ranked, but which do not have any impact on their environment. This is what I wanted to share with you. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Gunther, and thank you, Carolina and Alma. I mean, the argument for linguistic diversity is really powerful in the light of the ecological problem and the need to draw on the wisdom of the whole range of insight and understanding of the relationship with the environment in moving towards solutions. I'm going to ask the big question and then we'll pass into the general discussion. I think the big question is, what do we do? We've got a situation where the world is becoming more multipolar, where the voices, including indigenous voices, are now being heard much more than they were. And certainly the geopolitical, economic configuration of power is opening up. But the knowledge system remains monocultural and hegemonic. When you look at what's in the bibliometric collections, which is what defines what science is, what leading knowledge is, what valid global knowledge is, it's very constrained. It's constrained 98% to work in English. It's certain scientific disciplines are well represented. The social sciences and the humanities, even in English, are not well represented, and beyond English, very, very poorly represented. So the great bulk of intellectual work in the world is left outside the legitimate knowledge system as it's defined. And that legitimate system is what comprises the Scopus collection, the Web of Science collection. And from we get bibliometrics, from that we get the rankings, all of the decisions that are made by universities about what's high value science and what's high value knowledge, who should be appointed to positions, who does well, and so on in that science system determines who has power academically. So it's really fundamental. What is knowledge? What's included? Now, De Sousa Santos has put up a really brilliant argument for breaking down the binary, between exclusion and inclusion, in moving beyond coloniality, which he argues has defined this knowledge system in many ways, and in opening up knowledge systems so that we establish an ecology of knowledges where there's horizontal relationships between different bodies of thought across a huge range of languages. My question is, I think there's a lot of intrinsic potential support for that kind of idea in the world now. My question is, how do we move towards it instrumentally? What steps do we take that can advance that idea of an ecology of knowledges and bring Gunther's many languages and wisdoms into the picture globally? How can we do it? Any thoughts?
Well, can I start?
Yes, Alma, yeah.
Yeah, first of all, thank you, Carolina and Gunther for these presentations, I think. And I have been reading all these comments in the chat. Thank you to the participants. Well, I would like to comment about, first of all, that regarding options, as you ask, Simon, what are the alternatives, right? And one of the things that unfortunately we won't have time to discuss is what happened with these alternatives, because I think Gunther presented a great approach about what are these intercultural universities. I know the work by Daniel as well. But there is another issue, and it has to do with to what extent these institutions reproduce exclusion, because when these are the only options for indigenous communities to access to higher education, eventually this might have an impact in terms of their lives, their labor options, their alternatives, to what extent these institutions constrain what these communities can choose to study or not to study. And this is a big debate, and obviously we won't have time. I just want to say that intercultural universities, at least in the case of Mexico, were established before this government, not they have been here for a while. So I was writing this paper about rankings and Latin America, and obviously, you know, it's a big discussion. Obviously, I agree with Carolina in the sense of how these influences have impact and have created a lot of anxiety in Latin America in terms of we are not there, and we might not be there never, right? And how hard it is for us to try to catch up with Western, prestigious, European top-rank universities. But what I think, after discussing this topic and exploring, you know, data and so on, one of the things I realized is that this self-pity of Latin American universities is also not helping us, I think, because, you know, this, where is this agency that, you know, what is the agency that we need to use and take advantage? And I think we need to play the game. I do believe that. And I think that also it's not a matter of having just one strategy. I was looking at the different strategies, and Simon knows much more about this, but different strategies that China is following when they think about peer-reviewed journals and publishing, and they have several strategies. You don't have to you know, just get one strategy, but we need to consider different strategies. Some of them might be contradictory. I mean, you need to build your own publications in your own language because it's very important, but you also need to push and to help academics to continue publishing in English, because this is also important, and knowledge production, it's a worldwide issue, and so on. Anyway, I don't want to take more time, but I think those are things, and I have other questions. If there is time, I would love to answer those questions.
Colleagues, we don't have much time left, but we have a lot of people, I think, who are ready to say interesting things, and I want to get them into the discussion. So I suggest what we do now is we take a succession of questions and statements from people who have indicated an interest in speaking, and then we take the panel successively at the end to respond to the things which have been said and asked. I don't think we can go through a single question and answer with each person, because the answers can go for 5 minutes. So, and that alone will block us out. So I think one set of answers will probably be the best way to handle it, and one set of questions. So what I'm going to do now is call in the succession of people. It's going to be more or less as it appeared in the chat. We probably won't be able to get through the full list. I'll do my best. But can I ask the questioners to please be succinct? Please be succinct, to make room for other people as well. Thanks, colleagues. And our first question on that sequence is Rajani Naidu.
Thank you. One question and one comment. Epistemic relativity is a really difficult issue, and I really like Gunther's idea of supplementing that with the concept of positionality and plurality. I think these are very important pathways to take. But nevertheless, even so, I think we will still be left with the question of what and where are the outer limits of epistemic relativity, of positionality and plurality. And for example, think about the situation of a global pandemic. What sort of knowledge is important and valuable in that context? And the second is that science and indigenous knowledge do not always come into conflict. There are important overlaps between progressive science and indigenous knowledge, for example, in relation to biodiversity and climate change. And I think we should very much try to highlight that a lot more. Thank you.
And thanks, Rajani. So hang on to those 2 points and remember them. And I think the first one will come back a bit. And next is Pete Leahy. Pete.
Unmute. Excellent. Thank you very much. Great show. Very enjoyable. I would like to know about a couple of the indigenous languages that are doing particularly well and have more speakers today than they had before Columbus, being Quechua, of course, which is consolidated over the past few hundred years. It was always the administrative language of the Inca Empire, but now has more native speakers. And Guarani, which of course is one of the national languages of Paraguay and also spoken in the neighboring countries. Thank you.
Thanks, Pete. Tristan McGowan.
Thank you very much. So my question stems from the comment that Alma made about the essentially European origins of the university, but the existence of other traditions around the world. So I wanted to ask, in terms of what decolonization and indigenous initiatives draw on for inspiration and learning, are there ancient traditions in Latin America that they can draw on directly, possibly Maya, so forth? And if not, are there contemporary indigenous educational forms that are drawn on to build this alternative model? Gunther went some way towards us answering that because when he took us through the fascinating alternative model at the end. But I wondered if there are anything else any of the speakers want to say about some of these inspirations.
Thanks, Tristan. Phil Altbeck. Phil.
Thank you. This is sort of related to Tristan's question, and that is and it's rhetorical since we're almost out of time. The particular Spanish university tradition and Portuguese university tradition, what role has it played over time in Latin America, and has it been a useful one?
Thanks, Phil. David Mills.
Thanks, everyone. Really quick question, really, to Alma primarily. You said you were particularly worried about the discourse of horizontality, and I wondered why you were worried about that in relationship to relativism. I don't think necessarily the two go together, but if you could say some more about that, it'd be very interesting. Thank you.
And Rocio Vera Flores.
Thank you. I will just read my comment. I think it is also important to look at the influence of the colonial antecedents of anthropology and archaeology as curricula within universities and educational centers devoted exclusively to anthropology and archaeology. And I speak from the specific context of Mexico as an indigenous woman who studied archaeology and now is living in Europe. Anthropology continues to distract us from important issues, and it continues to hide our voices and faces in diversity.
Well, thanks, colleagues. I think 6 questions is a fair bit to handle. So I'll have to ask Conway and Amanda and Christina to hold off. If our panel is able to get through those answers in sufficient time, I'll be able to bring you in, but we'll be battling, I think, to fit everyone in today. Colleagues, we might take the response in reverse order if we can, and we'll begin with Gunther and end with Alma. So Gunther, your thoughts, please, in response to our questions.
Thank you very much. Very fascinating questions. Also the ones in the in the chat I'm reading. What Rajani mentioned, I think the alternative to epistemological pluralism, and I mean pluralism in the sense of recognizing different legitimate sources of knowledge and different forms of validation of knowledge. I think the alternative now, which has been imposed by the hegemonic university, is a certain way of epistemological incest. It's monolingual, it's monocultural, and it therefore only acknowledges one way of validation of knowledge. In intercultural and indigenous universities, we are trying out very interesting approaches, for example, to validating viva committees in a communal way. So not only to have academics on a viva committee, but also wise men, wise women from the communities. And this changes the notion of knowledge, and this shows what you mentioned in your second comment, the overlaps between different sources of knowledge. It's just different ways of formulating them, different degrees of abstraction, but they are not completely opposed to each other. But I think what we need to be careful about is that due to these trends that Alma and Simon mentioned, we are becoming ever more incestuous inside universities, thinking only in English, publishing only in English. This prevents us from perceiving other kinds of realities. And this will question the quality of university knowledge in the future. I think in this sense, the proposal of decolonizing university is not only because of historical injustice, it's not only because of doing justice to indigenous people, it is for the self-interest of universities. The quality of university knowledge will decrease rapidly, and we will notice the delegitimization of universities after the pandemic, because we are only talking about vaccines, we are only talking about symptoms, but we are not talking about the origins of the crisis we are living. As to Pete's question, yes, you're completely right. There are some languages which in these processes have become like normalized languages, like Quechua, Nahuatl, Maya, etc., and other languages have been marginalized. And I combine this with, I think it was Tristan's question about ancient traditions. We have pre-colonial, pre-Hispanic traditions of literacy in different parts of the Andes and in Mesoamerica. And the languages which have this tradition of literacy have also a tradition of using language for power issues. And this means that inside indigenous America, we have also unequal relationships between languages. For example, in Veracruz, Nahuatl is a language which has, the language of the Aztecs is a language with a written history, which has sources in their own languages. And then we have Popoluca, for example, Yuntahui it's called. It's an oral language of a pre-Nahuatl culture, which also exists, and they insist on the orality of their language and not on literacy. And so we have internal hierarchies inside these languages, but all of them are somehow in danger because of the monolingual policies of the Mexican or other Latin American nation states. And so I think we don't need the same answer to very different contexts. This is why I called it an inductive turn. We need to think universities from the bottom up, and not from top-down traditions. As to Philip's question, finally, I think the most influential model in Latin America is still the Napoleonic University. And I think this is part of our problem. The complete divorce between teaching and research activities make it very difficult now to turn the whole university into a learning community, and into a community which also includes outreach activities as part of their research. And in this sense, I noticed, I worked before in Granada, in Spain, and it's the same kind of university where teaching and research are completely separated, and where you don't have community outreach activities. That far. As to Rocio, I completely agree with you. I think this is not about anthropology against other sciences. I think anthropology and archaeology very, very urgently need decolonization, and particularly anthropology and archaeology, as you know, in Mexico, which has been a hegemonic state science in order to nationalize indigenous cultures. Thank you.
And thanks, Gunther. Thank you very much for your contribution today. Carolina.
Yes, very short comments. Well, I think that Gunther has addressed most of the questions, and so very short comments about the ways in which models of universities that were born in, sorry about that noise, terrible, were born in Europe and were important into Latin America. So the first one is not only the Napoleonic model, is the Salamanca model. I think that the Salamanca model exported by Spain into Latin America, for example, has had a very important impact on the ways in which universities work and the idea of being focused on teaching, for example. It is also true that in Latin America, a lot of universities have been focused on teaching, for example, and research were conducted in research units. So there is this separation between these two tasks. So isn't the Napoleonic model, but also the Salamanca model. And one more thing about experiences about universities and this idea of indigenous universities and intercultural universities. I have been reading and learning a lot about different initiatives that are taking place across Latin America. And I think that they are quite invisible. So I would point to the concept used by De Sousa Santos and the sociology of absences. So the idea is that a lot of knowledge and valuable knowledge has been hidden away in Latin America. And now it is time to visualize it and value it. Thank you very much.
Mm-hmm. And finally, Alma.
Yeah, thank you very much again for all these questions. I just would like to address one, which has to do with the epistemic relativism, as I mentioned it. I was reading, and this is my worry, and unfortunately there is no more time to discuss this, but I was reading the book that is inspiring today the scientific policies in Mexico, in this government. And the book has to do with this horizontal production of knowledge. And one of the things they are arguing, and that's why I'm worried, has to do, for instance, with the way we need to move from the imposed conceptual cages that we live in academia. And although I agree with the fact that we need to, challenge concepts, to discuss disciplines, to discuss the role of anthropology, humanities, the discussion against positivism took place years ago. Of course, we need to challenge that. The way the alternative, the way they put the alternative worries me a lot, in the sense that suddenly they discuss that we don't need any more peer review. The peer review system failed because many reasons, and of course here we can discuss the several debates and the several negative aspects of peer review. But to say and to just comment and to argue that the whole system is a failure, I think we need to be more careful. To be honest, we need to be more careful, because in many ways the system, the way the system works, need to change. But it's not a matter of saying nothing works, right? And instead of having peer review systems, which we know how this has been contaminated by big publishers, and we can discuss all this, but not to say then instead of that let's have all the same voices, because there is no academic authority, there is no, as I said, merit, there is no things that where we have based the scientific world. And obviously this is a big discussion. Again, as I said, the way they are saying we don't need to have students, we all need to be peers. Yes, I agree in general with the discourse. It's good. And I think thinking more horizontally will be very useful for everyone. But I don't think we are there yet in building concrete alternatives which are realistic and which won't, which won't help us to reach in a better development for our societies, which at the end I think is what we all want. So thank you, Simon, and everybody.
Yeah, and thank you, Alma, and thank you, everyone. I really appreciate the way you've approached this discussion today. I mean, your three different voices and different ways of presenting and the way it all fitted together so well. I mean, it's frustrating, isn't it? We only have an hour, and the issues you were touching on are so fundamental and so interesting. We just catch glimpses of really important depths in the conversation, and then we don't get the chance to fully expand on it or fully develop it. So we have to do so in future occasions, on more occasions, keep this kind of conversation going. It's increasingly important in our webinar series now, the discussion of decolonisation and where we move on the ecology of knowledges. And I think we'll want to strengthen and deepen that. And we'd really like to have the three of you back on again and for further discussion. Our next webinar, folks, is we flip back into the UK and go mainstream. We've got Joe Johnson, Jonathan Grant, and Janet Oliva talking about an important report which has come out in the UK about China-UK links in the university sector. So this is strategically significant in the UK context because it's the UK steering its way somewhere between America and China, or probably more closer to China, closer to the US than to China, but trying to sustain China as a sort of land of opportunity for the UK. So I don't need to fill in the dots for you, but that discussion is of course very strategically significant. And the question of China is, I think, is a gravitational force dragging the whole world discussion of higher education and science into new territory. It's making it possible, I think, for the decolonisation discussion, for the multi-regional discussions to come onto the agenda, because it's dethroning the old Anglo-American hegemony to some degree. But next webinar, we'll talk about how the UK is going to try and find a way through that nonetheless. Thank you again for your contributions, Gunther, Alma, and Carolina. And thank you everyone for participating and staying to the end, as you did enthusiastically. So long now, and we look forward to seeing you next Thursday. Bye for now.
Bye.